Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar of Big Data at Heart. My name is Dwayne Schultes. I'm the Managing Director of Vital Transformation, and I'd like to welcome you to this webinar today called Making Data Sharing AI and Algorithms Possible. Thank you very much for your participation today. Now, before we get started and I introduce the panel, just a couple points here. If you're having trouble with your audio connection or your internet speed, on this little menu button here next to mute, there's an arrow. That menu can pop up and you can switch to phone audio, and then you can change to the phone numbers. We've provided several dozen international toll numbers for you if you're having internet connectivity problems. We absolutely want you to be able to interact with us today, so please feel free to use these if you are having connection issues. As well, we will be taking your questions. We've had several hundred people register today, which is excellent. It's obviously a very important and vibrant topic. We will want your questions, so please use the Q&A button on the menu, submit your questions, and then we will circulate these to the panel whilst we progress through the webinar. And again, thank you for joining us today. It's great to have you with us. In this webinar, we'll discuss how Big Data at Heart is incorporating next generation data techniques such as artificial intelligence and algorithms into its research, as well as highlight best practices and use cases to share large data sets across geographically separate and disparate health data platforms. And again, I'd like to welcome our fantastic panel who's joined us today. I'd like to start by introducing Spiros Danakis, who's the Professor of Biomedical Informatics at University College London. Spiros, thank you very much for joining us. It's a pleasure to meet you and work with you today.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much.
I'd also like to introduce everyone to Danny Prieto Alhambra, who's the Professor of Pharmaco and Device Epidemiology at University of Oxford. He's also a senior researcher and participant in the IMI Project Eden. Danny, it's great to see you. It's been a while. Good to be working with you again. How are you?
Delighted to be here.
Thank you, Danny. And finally, last but not least, Ghislaine Van Thiel, Associate Professor of Medical Ethics at the University Hospital Utrecht. Ghislaine, always a pleasure. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Dwayne.
So to get things started, we're going to kick off with Spiros, who's running several aspects of the Big Data at Heart research platform. Spiros, I understand you have a presentation. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Cool, thank you very much. So let me just share my screen. Okay, let me know when you can see my slides.
They are coming. There you go. You're good to go.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you very much for having me here today and giving me the opportunity to talk. And I'll just start off by giving a short talk about how we can define and share disease algorithms that define phenotypes rather than actually sharing data, because that's sort of the area that I'm involved with at the moment. So yeah, I'm a professor of biomedical informatics at University College London, and part of the Big Data Consortium working around data standardization. And I also spend one day per week at the BHF Data Science Center working with national electronic health records that are sort of generated during routine interactions with care. And this is a picture of my research lab during one of our away days in Greece some years ago, when we were allowed to leave the house and do stuff. So I'll talk about electronic health records and the data that we use for research. So broadly, electronic health records are data that are generated when patients interact with healthcare, whether you get admitted into hospital, you visit your family doctor. I've classified them in 4 broad types: structured records, so things that get recorded using controlled clinical terminologies like ICD-10 or SNOMED; unstructured, so clinical text; binary data, so medical imaging and everything related to that; and streaming data, so things like ECGs, EKGs, Holters, and increasingly smart devices that we all sort of carry with us that generate a lot of data. So all of these data are potentially sort of very, very useful for research purposes. But it's very important to also note that these data are not captured for research, but are captured for care or payments or other things. So as a result, when you work with electronic health records, you get very, very messy, noisy, diverse, and fragmented information. And compared to research data, such as data from sort of research cohorts or clinical trials, EHR data sort of need a significant amount of pre-processing in order to become useful. So researchers need to clean the data, understand the data, and build algorithms that go from the raw data, which is like individual Lego bricks, to like the nice house on the right. So you define algorithms that work with the diverse data from multiple sources to define a particular disease. So that process is called EHR phenotyping. So you define a phenotype, it could be a disease or a biomarker or a particular sort of laboratory value in EHR data. And these algorithms that go from raw data to these sort of disease phenotypes are called phenotyping algorithms. And that's sort of the domain that I work with at the moment. It's also important to note that given the multimodal aspect of electronic health records, combining structured and unstructured and all the different data types, phenotyping can take many different kind of manifestations. And you can have very simple phenotyping algorithms, which are simply rule-based algorithms, or very complicated things like learning representations from data using AI and machine learning methods to analyze and compact large amount of EHR data. In BigData Heart, we use basically most of these types of approaches, I think with the exception of natural language processing, because that's always very hard to get at large amounts for research in order to define phenotypes and create sort of algorithms to use in our research. What does a phenotyping algorithm look like? So this is a very simple example of something that we've used in BigData Heart. And outside, this is an algorithm to define atrial fibrillation. So you take electronic health records from patients from their primary care physician, the hospital, the mortality records, diagnoses and prescriptions, and then using this sort of these flowchart algorithm, you identify who has atrial fibrillation, it's a cardiac arrhythmia, when did they get it, which source it was diagnosed first into, and if they don't have a diagnosis code of AF, so there's no diagnosis of this condition in the record, can we infer on the right-hand side them having this disease based on prescription patterns and excluding other things that these prescriptions might be related to. So this is sort of a very simple yet kind of very scalable approach to defining a phenotype in complex EHR data. One of the key challenges in creating these algorithms is the fact that information is very fragmented. And like I said initially, electronic health records are not created for research, but are created for care or for administrative purposes. And the clinical terminologies that are used themselves are extremely fragmented. And anybody who's, for example, used ICD-10 knows how polarized it is, that it could go from sort of, very specific ICD-10 codes on being hit by a washing machine while riding a sort of a motorcycle to very, very broad things like cardiovascular disease and everything in between. So part of the challenges in phenotyping is creating algorithms that can work with these heterogeneous types of data sources and define, what you actually want as your exposure or your endpoint in research. Of course, validation is very important, and that's kind of intrinsically a part of the phenotyping process, that once you have defined the algorithm, you need to validate it using multiple layers of validation in order to prove what you're identifying as being the correct kind of phenotype. And the gold standard is essentially what's done a lot in the US, where you can define sort of your phenotype and then look at the actual case notes using a sort of clinical experts and define PPVs and things like that. But obviously that's very hard and that doesn't scale. So there's all sorts of sort of layers in validation that you can employ. So obviously, I think I've sort of persuaded you so far that there's a lot of work that goes into creating these phenotyping algorithms and validating them. And that's not only clinical input, but also input from computer scientists and health data scientists. So given the amount of resources that go into these algorithms, it's also vitally important to basically be able to share and reuse and extend these algorithms across the wider scientific community. And we've done a lot of research in BigData at Heart and more widely on being able to define these as a computable format. So this is sort of from recent work that Václav Papej from my team led on using semantic web technologies to create a machine-readable version of these phenotyping algorithms, because the majority of these algorithms are essentially a collection of Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, CSV files, all floating around. So one of the sort of biggest goals that we have is using computable phenotyping algorithms to sort of create machine-readable versions of these. One of the projects that I've also been leading on a national level is the creation of this HDR UK phenotype library. So this is an open access library that researchers can upload and curate and share and disseminate the algorithms that they use. So the idea here being that for every research output that you have, in its own DOI that can be directly cited from sort of the research paper and cross-referenced. And you can then export all the data and the metadata associated with that algorithm in order to plug it in your own tools or extend it or reuse it in whatever way you want. And behind all of this, it's a GitHub repository that has machine-readable sort of versions if you want to do any bulk inputs or bulk processing. So obviously, this is still working at the level of using multiple bespoke, different kind of data sets and data sources. And this is just a flag, sort of a good segue to Danny's talk. And what we've been doing through Eden and through BigData at Heart is harmonizing data and building these algorithms on top of OMOP. So we've converted Caliber, which is one of the projects that I've been working with for quite a large amount of years on CPRD data linked to HES linked to NS. And more recently, we finished the conversion working with Eden and colleagues at the Hive in the Netherlands of the UK Biobank. And then, that gives sort of great opportunities because based on that sort of, converted data set, for example, in the UK Biobank, we can sort of define all of the algorithms that we've used on BigData at Heart or elsewhere and sort of scale them and further validate them. So I think, I think it's a very exciting moment in research because the COVID pandemic has unlocked a lot of data sets, not only through Eden, but sort of more widely. And we have a very kind of unique opportunity to use all this electronic health records data, both in the UK and elsewhere, to sort of create these types of phenotypes, validate them, and use them at research, and eventually, being able to define and redefine clinical disease because we now have the sample sizes to look at large amounts of data. So thank you very much. Those are the slides I had.
Thank you very much, Spiros. Very exciting, nice table set. Very good. Thank you very much. One core question here. When we're talking about machine readable phenotyping in particular, one of the concerns, if you talk to CROs, contract research organizations, and some of the end users who try to use this in clinical research practically, it's cost, because as you point out, often you do need to dig into the case notes to validate the result, at least as it is currently. How far are we away from making this efficient and not cost prohibitive? I mean, are we there? Are we getting there? Is it practical right now?
Yeah, I don't think it's practical at any stage, and I think it's not only scalability issues that prevent it, but it's also issues around information governance and being able to look at sort of the raw notes and things like that. And especially when you work with, as we're doing now with national data, 56 million patients, and you want to look at thousands of diseases, you just can't do manual review. And that's why I'm a big fan of like this layered approach where you could potentially do parts of validation for specific diseases, but it's not a one size fits all. So the more sort of validation layers you can offer, the more you can include, sort of increase the confidence in your algorithms. But that being said, there will always be use cases where that kind of approach doesn't work. So if you, for a clinical trial, for example, where you might want to be able to adjudicate outcomes and things like that, where you would need to have that sort of manual review or manual adjudication. But for other studies, you might not to. So it's all about striking a balance between the resources and sort of the sensitivity, specificity that you're willing to put up with.
That's great. Thank you, Spiros. Again, lots we could talk about. We have two other excellent presenters. I'd like to now move on to Danny. Danny, as I mentioned, you've been heavily involved. We mentioned not only BigData at Heart, but Eden, but you're also involved in the use cases for these things practically. Again, the floor is yours. Look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dan. Let me share my screen. That always takes a couple of seconds more than I wanted. We always get there in the end.
You're good to go.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to discuss the work that we have been doing, harnessing the OMOP CDM to study COVID vaccine safety, amongst many other things, COVID-wise. The three topics I will cover: a very quick refresher on what we're talking about when I talk about distributed network analysis and some fresh news from Eden. I will then show you some work we've done looking at background rates of adverse events of special interest for the monitoring of vaccine safety. And then I will finish showing some data that we have now in preprint, looking at the observed versus expected rates of of events that are probably of interest to our audience, including venous and arterial clot or thromboembolism and thrombocytopenia. Okay, so let me start with the first bit. Eden has been set to some degree is this federated data network where the idea is that we give up grants to data partners so they can map their data, just as Spiros explained with UK Biobank. They then have a local OMOP instance of their data, which is already harmonized and in the same structure as the data that we have from other partners. And then we can run federated or distributed queries, as you can see here. So a principal investigator, it doesn't need to be somebody within the Eden consortium, basically writes some code, typically R code, that runs on the OMOP databases and then gets results in an aggregated fashion back. And this is the way we have been doing things for the last couple of years and the way we are growing the network. We do have some tools, of course, that we apply and we leverage from the use of a common data model to produce reproducible and reusable code. The OMOP CDM, I won't spend more than 2 seconds on this, but it's a patient-centric common data model with a relational design, built for analytics, tabular, extendable, and it's been around for a very long time. The Eden network, I'm only discussing here or showing the data partners, so people who have data and have or are in the process of mapping their data to OMOP, a total of 98 people with a signed contract already. And fresh news from this week, we closed our 5th data partner call and had 89 applicants. I know I have a panel of reviewers now who are probably not delighted with the number of applications they have to review, but it's great to see competition kicking in and increasing increasing numbers of applications to become part of the Eden family. Okay, I'll show you first the work we've done on estimating background rates of adverse events of special interest. As you will all remember, back in February, March, we started hearing that some people had blood clots after having COVID vaccines. Regulators were looking for data on rates of those same events in the general population, so they could basically do what they do first, which is comparing post-vaccine rates to pre-vaccine or pre-pandemic, ideally, rates to say, okay, are we observing more than we expect? We had luckily already done this work and we had already published it. And you can imagine that this is a paper that we are proud of because it's been heavily cited and used by many stakeholders around the world. And this was basically characterizing the incidence rates of COVID-19 vaccine adverse events of special interest. There was a list of events that the FDA and the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and other regulators around the world had pre-specified, and we of course went for those. And we produced this beautiful data, which is basically age and sex specific incidence rates of a total of 15 events of interest, using data from 13 databases from, as you can see, Australia, France, Germany, Japan, the US, the UK, Spain, and the Netherlands. So a very comprehensive assessment of those incidence rates. Interesting things that one could remember. First, there are events that increase with age, of course, and that are more common in men than women. And it's no secret that acute myocardial infarction, especially when I'm giving a talk to BigData Heart, is one of those events. Appendicitis, on the other hand, has a very different association with age, and even less so anaphylaxis, which has actually a decline with age. So anaphylaxis is more common in children than in older populations. Another interesting observation is that there is massive across database variation, even within a same age and sex stratum. And you can see for some events like narcolepsy, which doesn't have really very clear diagnostic criteria, how there is a lot of variation, like 100-fold variation between databases, whilst for others like Guillain-Barré, that is much smaller, and probably that is because, of course, that condition requires much more diagnostic effort and probably has a more specialized diagnosis. So bearing that in mind, we produced also this table that I know, again, has been heavily used. These are meta-analytic estimates of age and sex-specific incidence rates of all these 15 events of special interest, according to age and sex, in using the data from the 13 databases that we had access to. So in conclusion, background rates are not one number. I appreciate that is what people wanted at the beginning when they said, oh, we are observing 20 blood clots in 100,000 people. Is that more or less than you expect? Actually, you need to know a little bit more than that. You need to tell me the age and the sex of your population, or otherwise things can get really, really, really messy. Another learning I think that's very important is that if you are going to do this observation of after vaccine versus background rates, you need to use the same database, please, because otherwise, again, the variability across databases will play up. So talking about that, I'll finish by discussing for 5 minutes or 4 minutes the data that we have on observed versus expected rates of venous, arterial thromboembolism, and thromboembolism with thrombocytopenia following vaccination and infection with SARS-CoV-2, data from Spain and the UK. These two papers are in preprint and still under review in a journal that is taking a lot longer than I wanted. And these are the methods we use. We use data from a primary care database from Spain that covers 80% of the region of Catalonia until May 21. Data from CPRD in the UK covering around 15-20% of the population until the end of March. And then we had these two databases mapped to OMOP as part of previous Eden grants. We had relatively younger populations, 20 plus, 30 plus from both countries, and we imposed that only people with at least 1 year of data visibility could participate. 4 cohorts, people were vaccinated with ChAdOx, people vaccinated, that's the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, people vaccinated with BNT, that's the Pfizer vaccine, a COVID cohort, so it would be people with a positive test against SARS-CoV-2 infection for the first time in their history, and then the background population, which was basically the general population in those databases in 2017 to 2019. We followed people up to 28 days in the primary analysis and up to 90 days in secondary analysis. Outcomes, I've already said, VTE, which is deep vein thrombosis or pulmonary embolism, and on top of that, of course, the very interesting and rare and very uncommon cranial thrombosis and splanchnic and portal vein thrombosis. On top of that, we looked at the co-occurrence of thrombocytopenia with thrombosis that we called TTS. Basically, the analysis is pretty simple. One calculates the incidence rates post-vaccination, and in the general population, as we said earlier, we adjusted, or in this case, standardized by age and sex to take into account the differences in the sociodemographics of vaccinated populations and background populations. Results, very large numbers of participants, of course. The general population and the COVID cohorts were much younger than the vaccinated population, especially in UK data, because that is data from March. The uptake of the vaccines is very different from both countries, and that is why they didn't meta-analyze or pool or anything. And you can see how Spain used AZ in a very, very small part of the population in a very specific time, whilst the UK started, of course, with Pfizer, but then started having more and more vaccination with AstraZeneca. This figure contains a lot of information, but I just want you to focus on the right-hand side where we produce the standardized incidence ratios. What you can see here basically is a 20% approximately increased risk of venous thromboembolisms with the vaccine, with the Pfizer vaccine, but not with the ChAdOx vaccine in Spain, a much higher increased risk of venous thromboembolism post-COVID, up to 15 times higher than expected. And again, in the UK, very similar data. In this case, we had an increased, like a 20% increased risk of pulmonary embolism also with ChAdOx as well as with Pfizer. And again, very consistently up to a 1,500% increased risk of these events after COVID. So in summary, I'm running out of time. Very different use and uptake of the vaccine in both countries. Population vaccinated was older and with more comorbidity than the general population, and therefore there is a risk that there is some confounding that we haven't really truly resolved. But still, we observed this little signal of 10 to 20% higher than expected rates of VTE, but a much higher increased risk of this same event post-COVID-19, which is indeed the counterfactual of vaccination. I will, I think, stop there, and I'll be delighted to discuss any questions. Dwayne.
No, thank you very much, Danny. You mentioned it's taking a while to get it published. Uh, I don't know if you had rimmer feedback. Again, you've got some controversial results or some results that some people might not like to hear about some aspects, unfortunately, about, there is a raised, slightly elevated risk post-vaccination. Again, we know vaccines aren't 100% safe. This is expected. Obviously, it's safer than getting COVID. I think about the Danish mask study where they had the results and it took them several months because no one wanted to publish the results because people, there's a certain feeling that, well, these aren't the results we'd necessarily like to see. How long how long has it been? I mean, what's the situation now?
No, I think the time it's taken to publish is that maybe we were a little bit too ambitious going for very high impact journals that got similar data from other places earlier
Sure.
than we did. So doing international data research is always a process that takes a little bit longer than doing an analysis of a database that you have sitting in your laptop pretty much, right?
Yeah.
So there have been additional papers on this same topic in the journals that we had submitted to. So fair enough, we're in a kind of second tier journal where I think this data will get published very soon. Of course, that also what happens when that occurs is that then the journal editors want more up-to-date data, and then you need to update your data set, and it's not something that you do overnight. I think this kind of data is necessary. It's data that regulators get all the time, and I don't think there is any secret in the data or anything worrying. Actually, what really worried me is that 15 times higher than expected rate of pulmonary embolism after COVID, which I couldn't quite believe when I saw it the first time, and getting the same exact result from two very large databases from two different countries is quite something. So I think that is a very important signal to highlight.
And there's been a general concern about this across all society right now, where there seems to be an inflated rate of unknown heart attack occurring with people. And obviously, given the rate of asymptomatic cases of COVID, that would seem logical that we would see that. How long would a study, I mean, again, we're talking millions of data points. If you would not have had OMAP and Odyssey, how long did it take you to put it together? And how long would it, I mean, you're an epidemiologist, you've been around the block a few times. How long would this have taken if you'd not had that tool?
So as I said, if you are only to use one database from one country or two databases that you have access to directly, I believe that is probably doable relatively quickly at the same pace. But if you are to touch data from different countries, as we did in this case, we have data from 6 countries. I've only presented data from 2. Then that multiplies the duration of the study quite exponentially. So it's much harder to do international research if you don't use a common data model and you don't have the experience of mapping that data from previous rounds.
Yeah, well, that's great, Danny. Thank you very much. I'd like to move on now to Ghislaine Van Thiel. Obviously, we've touched earlier on the necessary, sometimes need to go into the doctor's notes, which causes ethical issues. Obviously, there are some ethical issues around AI and algorithms. And Ghislaine, you are going to address some of the research you've been doing in this space. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dwayne. I will start sharing my screen. So the question to me was to go into ethical aspects of AI in big data research. Within Big Data at Heart, me and my colleagues are working on the governance model for international data sharing. And with this talk, I would like to give a high-level overview of ethical issues in artificial intelligence that are currently internationally discussed. And also give an idea of how this could be approached in governance of work in consortia such as Big Data at Heart. There has been a lot of talk about ethics of artificial intelligence, and of course we need to manage these issues in order to maximize the benefits of what we do, and to make artificial intelligence also acceptable from a societal and ethical and a legal point of view. And as I said, there has been a lot of ethical discussion already around this, and also some high-level guidelines have been published. And in the literature, there has been a synthesis of the principles that are proposed for ethical AI. And the authors, Floridi and Coles, they kind of made a synthesis of the most recently published frameworks for ethical AI. And they also made sure that these frameworks were directly relevant for AI and that they were also highly reputable. So they were published by authoritative multi-stakeholder organizations with at least a national scope. And they identified 5 principles, and they said that they found it quite reassuring that these principles there was a lot of convergence around these principles in the guidelines published internationally. And these are also quite akin to bioethics principles, with the exception of the last one, and that's the one I will go into most too. So I will go through these principles quite quickly. I think people who have heard about medical ethics will recognize at least the first 4. The first principle calls for AI to promote the well-being of people and the planet, and to make sure that, for example, there's no arms race or something for which AI is used, or that this should really be directed towards the common good. And researchers and other institutions employing AI are also responsible to promote the well-being not only of people and other sentient beings, but also the planet as a whole. The second, and I think this is the principle that attracts the most attention, is to avoid the misuse of artificial intelligence. And within this idea of misuse, we usually talk about privacy. So people are kind of reduce the whole issue of misuse to compliance to the GDPR. And as long as you're compliant, you'll probably be, oh, I see. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, it's okay. And within this, so the protection of personal privacy is at the core of this discussion about ethics. And of course, infringements of privacy are serious, and we should still worry about this. But the whole idea of this principle is that it should be taken up much broader, because artificial intelligence technologies can of course be misused, as any technology can, but also they can do harm because of inherent bias that may be introduced into algorithms, for example. And because this is also still work of humans, and their social biases, for example, will be imputed in these, for example, algorithm models. And it's quite hard to avoid that these biases are not amplified, for example, by machine learning technique or self-training mechanisms. So if we do not have a good understanding of artificial intelligence and good procedures to avoid harm done by AI, then this may even increase discriminatory practices or unequal practices among people. Another point is the idea that artificial intelligence should not take over human autonomy. So, for example, there's been the discussion about the Dr. Watson, Watson for Oncology computer, which of course gives an advice to patients and doctors based on numerous types of information sources. But the core value of around this advice is that everything is centered around maximizing the lifespan of people. And this is not always in line with every patient's preference. So the idea that a certain value might direct which kind of information and which kind of advice people and their doctors get is important, because it can also diminish patient autonomy. And this is even stronger for the idea that there are artificial intelligence technologies that kind of exclude human autonomy. And there's been a lot of discussion about the idea that the autonomy of machines, so what they can do themselves, should be intrinsically reversible by humans. So humans should always be able to regain power over the machine at any time when they think some harm or other issues might be involved. The fourth principle is the principle of justice. This is the principle that calls to ensure that the outputs of AI and algorithms are not biased, and even though the data may reflect social biases, so a fair outcomes of applications of AI is what's at stake here. And these are also core principles of more traditional biomedical ethics. But there has been a principle for ethical AI added to this discussion, and it's the principle of explicability, or also by some also call this explainable AI. And this consists of two parts. It's the intelligibility part, and that means that we have to know how does an AI system work. So the idea is that we have to reduce the black box character of models, especially when we would identify certain harms that come from are caused by artificial intelligence applications. Then the basis of such a decision that causes harm, or we should be able to identify why this harm was caused, and so the basis of the decision behind that should be discoverable. And the last element is the element of accountability. And this is something that we have been working on also in Big Data at Heart, because of the large-scale networks that are involved in applying AI technology, it's an important and widely discussed question: who is responsible for how applications work and what they bring about? And therefore, we also need this governance activities, and this has to go further than just identifying these principles, because these principles can guide the development of a governance framework, but it has the risk of leading to what we would call a so-called drawing board governance as a dominant model. Like you could apply kind of a clean sheet and draw your governance model around this, whereas these practices of artificial intelligence and the use of big data are a totally different context than just a situation where you would start from zero. And this is something that we already learned, I would say, the hard way in Big Data at Heart, that this drawing board governments, kind of a top-down governments telling everybody to apply these principles, that this is not the way to go forward. Instead, what we are now working on is that we have to look at the characteristics of research networks, in which not only the technologies, but also the chain of actors are quite black boxed. And we need to identify who is responsible for certain aspects of ethical AI in the network. And this can aid in further shaping the accountability. So this is what we are currently working on. We are making a final draft of our next paper, in which we will propose a learning accountability governance, in which you move away from applying just these 5 principles towards expressing these principles through a learning network. So that was from my side.
Thank you very much, Ghislaine. Thank you very much. It's thank you. Very interesting, and obviously brings up some issues, particularly around avoiding misuse of AI and accountability. I'd like to also invite the rest of the panel here. We're going to open up the discussion as well. If you in the audience would like to submit a question, please go to the Q&A button. We will happily take your questions and submit them to the panel. So Glenn, following up on this avoiding misuse of AI and the issues of accountability, my first question is on May 6, 2017, The Economist had a bold headline across the cover saying that data is the new oil. If we assume that oil is a commodity, that means we're talking about global competition for assets. We're seeing something that data is of value. How do we make sure that Europe still has accountability but doesn't overregulate or comes to the point where they can't compete in this new globally commodified business of data? How do you actually make sure that we don't restrict our ability to use the data while still being accountable?
Yeah, I think we can all agree that overregulation is a problem, not only in Europe, by the way, but and maybe in other parts of the world, underregulation is a problem. So this is a discrepancy between the idea that you should adhere, for example, to the principle that these techniques should be used for the common good. But regulation, of course, is not only meant to structure all kinds of economic issues, but also to make sure that there's no misuse of data in terms of oppression or other violations of human rights. And of course, this is maybe less in Europe, but in other parts of the world, this is a risk in reality. And we have to be careful that because of all these regulations, that we do not move away from the accountability of persons and even machines to do no harm. So my worry is that over-regulation kind of leads to a moral erosion where we don't even take accountability ourselves. Also as a consortium such as Big Data at Heart, but we kind of move it away all to tick box regulations, whereas this is not always the most effective way to adhere to what we actually think is good.
Thank you. Now, Danny, picking up on that then, if we don't want to overregulate, how does Odyssey and OMOP, sort of the guts and platform of how you handle data, how do those get around these issues to make sure that we can still leverage the assets that Europe has? I mean, Europe's had public health for 20, 30 years. If we go 1956 with the UK, if we go back to the establishment of the NHS, I mean, this should have the largest longitudinal available data set of publicly held data on the planet, theoretically. How do we make sure that we can still compete, and how does OMAP and Odyssey get around that?
Yeah, so the approach taken by Odyssey and Eden is that we use this federated network approach where basically the data steward or the data custodian is responsible for the governance of that data, right? So if we do a study and Spiros participate with UK Biobank data, for instance, that he has mapped to OMOP, he's responsible for keeping that data in a secure space. He's responsible for asking for ethics if that is required, or for whatever data access approval he needs, and that is the way we do things. That doesn't mean, of course, that things can happen. Like he could send me an email with patient level data, but the tough of the most of the burden is on the data partners themselves. I think that is also beneficial in terms of competition and accountability, because it's very clear who is accountable for this in this particular instance, right? And also who has to be competing with others to have that resource that we call data. So I think our approach is good in that sense. We also have, I didn't have time to explain it, but we train SMEs, small and medium enterprises around Europe, to support people to map the data to OMOP, also helping hopefully the market of data access and data sciences more widely.
Quickly, just to that issue, where is Eden now with regards to its covered lives? How are you folks doing on actually building out the database? Where are you from actual size and scope of the data in the project?
So the project said officially in the DOA, in the contracts with IMI, that we would map data on 100 million people, and we are over 300 million, if I remember correctly. So we've done quite well on that end. We are still opening data partner calls, and we are still opening SME calls to train SMEs to help data partners to map the data. And I think we are now moving in the second stage of the project, which has to be about generating evidence with that data. As I showed today, it's no longer about how much data we can map and how many data partners we can have on board, but also now trying to do research and generate evidence, because also remember that when we do all this, it's not only about the risks, but also the benefits, right? So what is the benefit of having this data in this format? So I think that's those two examples that I presented today are very good ones of how, for instance, the European Medicines Agency could use our background rates and the FDA could use our background rates because we had access to this data in this format and we could do that very quickly. So I think it's now the second half of it and has to be about generating evidence in parallel to, of course, onboarding additional data partners.
That's great. Thank you very much. We have a question here from an Antonio Bordiera. Thank you, Antonio, for your question. Spiros, I'd like to direct this to you. Antonio asked, could you give me more detail on how the data is shared within the BigData at Heart consortia? Legally and technically speaking, due to the fact that it's personal data, are industries, I assume corporations and pharmaceutical industry, allowed to access the data for research? And do you have a shared catalog? Spiros, anything you'd like to address there?
Yeah, I think the broad rule is that data is very rarely shared. So given that the data, is personally identifiable, even if it is anonymized and it's sensitive, what most projects in BigData at Heart really does is that it brings analysts to the data. So for example, the data that I work with at University College London, we have multiple approved study protocols that go through a particular sort of information governance process, and then analysts that work for University College London and have a contract with that organization undertake the analysis. So we don't really send data over, for example, to a researcher that's somewhere else. This also includes pharmaceutical companies. So pharmaceutical companies, either they have a copy of the data on their own. So things like CPRD, for example, pharmaceutical companies can purchase a license just like we do, and we collaborate with them and they analyze the data in situ over there, or they might fund a position that sits in University College London. Equally, they don't send us their trial data, but they have analysts that work on the trial data. So broadly speaking, sharing data is quite difficult, at least in the context of healthcare. So you either run federated analyses, just like Danny mentioned, or you have analysts that are directly employed by an organization to analyze the data.
Now, to that point, then, if we look at, say, China, who is trying to get into the data business, allegedly, so we hear, 1.3 billion people, even if you're 1 in a million type person, there's 1,300 people just like you. Does having a federated data impede your ability to do analysis? Does that put us on the back foot, or does OMOP get over that, and does that make that basically an irrelevancy? Spiros, again, just quickly to you.
I don't think federated data adds a bottleneck. So obviously, having all the data in one particular location is beneficial. But that being said, if you can't do that, so if you think about what Eden has accomplished, or what technologies like OMOP have accomplished, imagine how would you run a study across 10 countries to look at adverse reactions on a particular vaccine? So if you started last year, you might finish in 100 years to get all the approvals and sort of convert the data and understand the data. So it's definitely like a step forward. So and we do have access now to national data. So we do have access, for example, now in the UK to data from 65 million patients, and it's all within a safe environment that is hosted by the National Health Service. So I don't think common data models versus centralized access are mutually exclusive, and you probably always need to combine the best of approaches in order to make things happen.
Thank you. Ghislaine, following up on that, if we look at, say, Dr. Ernst Hoffen from ETH Zurich University, he has been one of the thought leaders on patient-led opt-in data sets where the patients themselves own a database and then negotiate directly for R&D. Do you think these patient-led models, from your ethical standpoint, are a way we can move forward, or do you think that that will not give us enough coverage? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think it's one way to meet the need for control of also patients and the public in general over data, their data, and what's going to happen with their data. But the question is this the best way to do this? Because we are already speaking of a so-called digital divide, where some people are able to engage in these kind of conversations with R&D and whatsoever, but others are not able to do this. But still their rights are equally important to preserve in big data research. So I think the whole idea of being accountable also holds that we have to be able to explain why we are trustworthy to patients and the public. And building on this trust, and of course also some control of patients over what happens to data and the public in general, I think I would be in favor of taking that route as opposed to individual opt-in and opt-out systems and people having to do this over and over and over again.
Yeah, the specific consent rules, etc. Yeah, obviously. I'd like to remind people we've got about 10 minutes left in the webinar. Obviously, there's 1,000 things I can ask, and I'm sure the panel could ask each other, but we do want your input. So please, there's 70, 80 of you out there right now. Please be sure to submit your questions, and I'll circulate them through. Danny, one of the points I'd like to ask you, if we look at surveys on public opinion, there's obviously some issues at the public level, but there are many, many surveys that show that it's actually a lot of times practitioners themselves who are not willing to open up and share data sets, and particularly in Europe, where the data sets are often owned by research divisions themselves. They use this, given the fact these are government positions in Europe and they're bureaucratic positions, often funded by government. The commercial issues are more often about political power sometimes, and these people carve out a political situation within a university by having access to data. How do we balance that issue where often it's the practitioners themselves in Europe who are blocking data access?
I think that's a $1 million question. 1 million euro, I guess.
$1.2 million, I guess. Yeah, that's right.
Well, I think there's a lot in that question, Dwayne. So I think there has been a little bit of that in the past. There could still be a little bit of that currently. And that is something that I think is partially resolved, although not totally. I think my colleagues, my clinician colleagues, are increasingly aware of the importance of this research that we're doing. And I think the only thing we can do to convince them, if they are not convinced, is do good research and research that helps them in their clinical practice, right? Because in the end, if they perceive that all they are going to use to change or guide what they do in their clinics is randomized controlled trials, why would they give up their data for us to use for research? So I think there is an effort we can make there, but I think things are going in the right direction. So I think it's a kind of an organic puzzle that will fall in the right place, I hope. More interestingly, I think there's also situations where only a few people have access to data, and it's not very clear why they do and others don't, right? And that is a harder one, because that is one where I don't feel comfortable, where I don't think, where I don't feel there is enough transparency on how that works, and where I believe we need to do much more and be much more clear on the rules and the regulations on who has access to data and why, right? So I think CPRD, for instance, is a very good example of something that some people might not like, but at least it's very clear in terms of regulation, governance, and so on. So you can very easily go to the website and understand how it works if you want to use CPRD data, but that is not true for all the databases around Europe.
And obviously that's why CPRD is one of the most quoted databases on the planet. I mean, everyone uses it because it's there, available, and it works. We have a good question here from Maureen Cronin. Thank you, Maureen. Obviously one of the project leads for BigData Heart. Thank you for your participation today. Maureen's asking, can you comment on where we stand in Europe with specific cardiovascular data that can be accessed broadly by researchers? How does this compare to other regions? Spiros, I'm going to default to you since this is your wheelhouse as it is. How are we doing on general access to CVD data broadly for researchers?
And I mean, Yeah, it's hard to answer. I mean, I think my gut feeling overall is that data access is hard and it's challenging, and it's getting harder and it's getting more challenging as the years go by because of all sorts of sort of restrictions that come into play. I think, you know, at least in the UK, like Danny alluded to, we're in a very good position that we have a number of large data sets that have a proportional governance framework that you can access for research, like CPRD, like UK Biobank, like Genomics England, like things like that. And I'm sure, you know, there are in other countries, there are similar data sets as well. I think just from my limited knowledge of how things work in other countries, you know, every country has similar resources, like, you know, Denmark and the stuff Soren Brunak does, or like Spain, or other countries have less. And I think every country is different. So I think data access is still very fragmented, and there are different rules. And I think, again, that's one more kind of, I guess, cookie point to OMOP and CDMs and federated analysis, is that instead, you know, you can sort of, if you have data custodians that are very switched on, like hospital trusts or, you know, healthcare providers or things like that, you can enable analyses that would probably be more challenging to do or impossible if you try to do a more conventional, you know, let's take the data and analyze it in-house. So I think it's quite difficult to answer, but I think it's quite variable. Is my gut feeling.
Ghislain, from your perspective, obviously you're in the Netherlands, you've been involved in Big Data at Heart, but you've also been involved in Big Data for Better Outcomes and several other IMI projects. How with regards to cardiovascular data?
Well, I think overall in data that, of course, we have a harmonized regulation now with the GDPR, but this may be a form of over-regulation, but there's also, I think, a lot of people use it if they're not willing to share data. Because there's a lot of questions around it, and people tend to also kind of mistreat the regulation to use it as a shield for not sharing data, whereas you can actually in general. And of course, technical solutions are growing to meet the requirements of the GDPR. So I actually do not see how it is becoming more difficult to share data. It actually should be easier. But on the other hand, if you, as you just mentioned, data is the new oil, then we should realize that we should work on that side too, and not only say this is a thing of regulation, because it's not. It's also a thing of economic power, competition, and other issues. And only looking at the regulation, I think, will not solve this problem.
Thank you very much. Now we have time for just one more question I'd like to ask the panel. And again, if we could just make one, picking up what Ghislain just said, if we could just make one recommendation for the better harnessing of data for algorithms and AI, and, you know, for lack of a better word, big data, if you could make one recommendation today that could be implemented, what would you want to see? I'll start with you, Danny. If you had a magic wand and you could say, okay, boom, we'd like this done, what would you like to see done?
I would like to make sure that all access to data in Europe is fair in capital letters. I think I'll leave it there, and most people in the call know what I mean with that.
Sure, thank you. Spiros, from your perspective, obviously the UK now is outside of the EU in some respects, and has its ability to set its own data regulation policies. But what would you like to see done, Spiros, from the aspect of facilitating data usage, either regulatory or practically?
Yeah, I'd like to see us join the EU again.
Well, that'll be happening soon, I'm sure, Spiros. Not controversial at all. Okay, aside from that very easy task, Ghislain, what would you like to see done?
Yeah, of course, I would like to see us maximize all the benefits of the beautiful technology that we are developing, but also in a way in which we can really state that science helps promote the good for humans and the planet.
Finally, last question we've had from someone who just calls themselves spiritually AK. They want to know, how can they get involved in Big Data at Heart? Ghislain, I'll leave that with you. How, if someone's interested in Big Data at Heart, what should they do?
Wow. Well, I think our communications work package has a lot of ways in which you can follow the work in Big Data at Heart. The people who work there, I think, are traceable. So if there's anything you kind of want to work on, introduce yourself, and I'm sure that everybody's willing to talk if there's an option to do something.
Thank you very much. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for our participation, our panelists. Very wonderful time working with you today. For our audience, thank you very much. And we conclude this webinar. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.